Hello and welcome to another episode of Paper Pilgrims. I'm Sneha Nagesh.
And I'm Alex Breeden.
And in this episode, we're continuing to discuss Oe Kenzaburo's Nipthebuzzkids, his first novel, which he wrote at the age of 23.
We'd also like to thank the translators again for the edition we're reading. That's Paul St. John McIntosh and Maki Sugiyama for letting us do the readings.
In the first episode, we discussed Oe's mystical village. We were introduced to a group of reformatory boys who were being evacuated during the war. There's a disease in the village, and we see that the adults in the village are discriminating against these kids. Basically, they're being jerks. The kids were being forced by these adults to bury all the dead animals that had died from this weird disease.
They're locked up again, but this time one of their number dies during the night, so that one of them begins to yell till the headman, the village headman, and the blacksmith come to the temple. And after inspecting the body of the dead child, the two men leave. A little while later, an alarm is sounded, and a mass commotion can be heard outside the temple. The narrator and Minami, one of the other boys in the group, slip out of the temple and see that the villagers are deserting.
It was weird that they just leave the dead body in there with those kids.
Right, and I didn't realize this the first time I was reading. The dead body is the trigger that causes everyone to desert the village. There was no evidence that people are actually getting this disease. And then because this other boy dies, I think that's the trigger that causes all of these villagers to be scared out of their minds and want to get out of there.
I found this part quite harrowing because it's, you see that the kids are they're bound together by this really, they may not have much else in common, but they're bound together by the discrimination that they face.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the underlying things of the entire book, right? Is the solidarity between people who are being discriminated against. But the next morning, after all the adults have evacuated the village and left the children behind, the group of children walks through the deserted village and out to the trolley tracks, which they find have been barricaded with tree stumps, boards, and rocks. They see a man appear from the other end of the trolley tracks across the valley, and the man shouts,
Hey! We're still here, hey! The small brown face on the far side had obviously noticed us. Then he brought a hunting rifle from his shoulder to his chest and moved quickly to the rise on the left of the shed. We let our arms drop and gave up calling from our aching throats. We understood. The man had moved to a vantage point to watch for those bold, desperate spirits who might walk out along the track towards the other side. The barricade was built to thwart us, and moreover, there was even a sentinel standing guard. We were cut off.
So that was our reader, Bo Vu. This was the first passage in the book where I really felt moved by the novel. I mean, there's a real sense of injustice here where the kids are being left to die and being corralled in the village and cut off, being trapped and not even given a way out.
It's unclear why the villagers aren't communicating with these kids at all. So the kids aren't aware about what's going on, and that's even more cruel. Anyway, so the novel begins to pick up from here, right? Because this is sort of an inflection point. And then the boys, they return to the village, and then they start to raid the houses for food because the villagers have by now left the village. And I feel like, were they still, I had the feeling when I was reading this that the boys still felt wrong in doing this. They still felt a sense of committing a crime when they were raiding these houses.
For a long time, they leave the headman's house intact, so they're clearly not over their taboo of, property damage or damaging the things of their elders.
Right, and I remember thinking when I was reading this that I thought if the villagers had been in the boys' place, they wouldn't have had a second thought about going into all the houses and raiding all the stuff. So that was very interesting that these, boys who are supposed to be criminals are actually acting like decent human beings. Anyway, so at this point, a Korean boy comes into the scene, and he is trying to steal one of the sacks of rice that the boys have scavenged from these houses. And then the narrator of the book and this Korean boy, they kind of fight. But ultimately, the narrator sort of lets him get away with the sack of rice. And eventually this group of boys, they befriend this Korean boy. It turns out that he's actually mourning one of his colleagues or friends who's died. And the reformatory boys help him raise a stone monument. So that was quite moving as well, that they're sort of very respectful.
And this goes back to the whole solidarity among the discriminated. I mean, if you don't know that much about Japanese history, you might be wondering even why there's a random Korean boy in the middle of Japan in the middle of World War II. But there have been a lot of Koreans in Japan immigrating to Japan, at least since the 1920s, if not earlier than that. In the 1920s, it was Koreans were migrating to Japan voluntarily, mostly. I mean, Korea was a colony of Japan at this time, but the economy in Japan was much stronger than Korea. There was a demand for labor. But during World War II, there was more forced immigration, and the Japanese government, would take Koreans and move them to Japan and use them for forced labor. And so that's probably what these Koreans are doing here. The Korean encampment is probably a forced labor camp.
There's still lots of Koreans now in Japan who may be descendants of some of these people, or, well, there's like a Korean community living in Kyoto as well, which is not really, it's not talked about and it's not really promoted because I don't think they're living very well.
Another thing that might surprise people is that a lot of Zainichi Koreans, that is Koreans living in Japan, they don't even speak Korean. They speak Japanese, like they were born in Japan, they grew up in Japan, but they don't have Japanese citizenship and they can't speak Korean.
Living in between two nations, really. Anyway, so after this point, the boys also discover another young girl. So we've already been introduced to two new characters, Lee, the Korean boy, and then this young girl who has actually been abandoned by the villagers because her mom dies. And she's sort of found, she's in this warehouse with her dead mother. She's quite shy, but then the narrator, he seems to take a liking to her, so he coaxes her out with food. A sort of a budding romance is starting to develop here.
The younger brother finds a dog and quickly becomes attached to him. And lastly, Lee, the Korean boy, introduces the group of boys to the soldier who deserted the cadets. This deserted soldier was who the villagers were searching for before and the military was searching for earlier in the novel. And in this way, now that we have Lee, the younger girl, and the younger brother's dog, we have a community that's formed by all of those who have been abandoned by the villagers.
And this deserter is presented as he's done something terrible and he's very disappointing. He's presenting a sense of failure, sort of less attractive than the other military cadets who are pushing on with the war.
If you read about any interviews with Oe, he is clearly in support of deserters, and there's this one comment he made about a comment by Günter Grass, who is one of the German Nobel Prize winners for literature. And Günter Grass said the real heroes for World War II are the deserters, like the 20,000, I think there were 20,000 German deserters who were killed by the Nazis, executed by the Nazis for deserting. And Oe very strongly agreed with this comment. So I think we can be pretty sure that it's the deserter that Oe is sympathizing with. But he's a good novelist, so he's not going to make an unrealistic portrayal, an idealized portrayal of the deserter and bash you over the head with his viewpoint. He's a bit more subtle, and he is using realism, the techniques of realism in certain ways, even if there's some weird stuff in this novel. So I think it makes a lot of sense where we have this realistic portrayal. Initially, the deserter is disappointing, but later, as we get to know him and understand him, then our feelings about him change.
Yeah, you certainly can empathize with why he's behaving that way. And I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, I've read quite a few books about World War II, and not all of them mention deserters, apart from just, giving a stat about how many numbers there were. And it sort of it helped me understand a bit more about what you might be going through and the risks that you take and everything that you...
Yeah, deserting is an interesting topic that I think most governments and probably most conservatives don't want to talk about.
If for those listeners who aren't familiar with British comedy, there's a really good TV show called Blackadder, and one of the series, and it features Rowan Atkinson, who is Mr. Bean, and also Hugh Laurie, and a lot of other great people like Stephen Fry, and it's really great. But in one of the series, it's all set in World War I, which went very badly for Britain, although they claimed victory in the end. It was all trench warfare and it was a terrible time. Some of the episodes are kind of they show what war. It's pretty realistic, and I think the TV show won quite a lot of awards for being so realistic. It's also quite moving because you do sympathize with these army soldiers who are kind of caught in the middle of these trenches, and they need to proceed onto the battle lines and fight, but they have no motivation to whatsoever. So there's a lot of comedy here, but it's very realistic comedy and makes you empathize with these soldiers. I recommend watching that.
So on one of the following nights, the girl expresses how afraid of everything she feels, and the narrator decides to cross the trolley tracks, slip into the neighboring village, and find the doctor, who he plans to ask to come and get the girl. But when he gets to the doctor's house, the doctor is only concerned with his own fear of the plague. He drags the narrator back to the trolley tracks and kicks him, which is, this scene is a bit rough. I mean, clearly the entire elite is bankrupt. The doctor, who is supposed to be the most humanistic part of society, ostensibly, has just kicked out the kid for trying to get help for a little girl and is more afraid of getting sick himself.
He's given up, basically. He doesn't really care.
The narrator recrosses the trolley tracks and is met by the girl, who is in tears, afraid that she wouldn't see the narrator again. She takes his fingers, bloody from climbing on the trolley tracks, in her mouth. This excites the narrator, and he takes her into the warehouse.
And now we know what's going to happen next. But let's listen to a reading.
We went straight into the completely dark interior, and I silently dropped my trousers and lifted her skirt. I threw myself down on the girl's body. I groaned as my erect penis, like an asparagus stalk, caught in my underpants and was almost bent double. Then contact with the cold, dry, papery surface of her sex, and withdrawal with little shivers. I sighed deeply.
Yep, that was Bobu reading a very interesting passage in this book. Yeah, so in this passage we're back to always comparisons of sexual organs with fruits and vegetables. And
there's an award for the worst sexual writing. I believe Murakami Haruki won it one year.
Yeah, because as we were saying, first of all, at first these kids, so far you don't really know how old these kids are. From the way they've been behaving, you think that they're about 12, or up until now, the narrator and the girl have had it's a relationship based on kindness. The boy is bringing her food and he's sort of trying to cheer her up because her mother died. So it's very sweet.
But I mean, from another perspective, Oe is also taking a very non-idealized view of sex and love, and is very comfortable with the, coarse realities that exist in that relationship. And I think ultimately, he has a very healthy, I would say, non-puritanical view of sex.
Okay, so after this, the narrator goes back to find his brother, and then they go to sleep, and they find that the next morning, snow has fallen all over the village, and the village is full of snow. And the narrator is obviously still very pleased with himself, and he's feeling the flush of having slept with this girl who he's fancied up until now. I think this whole part is really very full of warmth because the younger brother is really happy as well. And they sort of cook together, and they share a meal of dried fish, and they sort of cook it over an open fire. And this part makes you feel like, suddenly everything is normal again. You kind of forget what else is happening around them because they share this moment of absolute happiness. Then the little brother speaks to the narrator, and this is what he says.
He spoke in a low, childish voice. Let's stay here always, for a long time, like this. You and I'll turn into ignorant, stupid grown-ups, I said. But like my brother, I too have begun to wish to live a long time in this house surrounded by snow. And every last exit was closed to us. What more could we want than this? I absolutely refuse to relive last night's humiliation.
Right, and by last night's humiliation, the narrator is obviously referring to the episode with the doctor and not his night with the girl.
So this is obviously the high point of the novel, and everything is going to go downhill from here.
So shortly after this scene, you'll remember that the younger brother of the narrator has a dog, and this dog, who's called Leo, bites this girl because the dog just wants to get a pastry that she has in her hand. This turns out quite badly for the girl because she gets an injury and then she gets sort of stuck in bed. And this is the start of the downfall, so to speak.
Even with the omen of the girls being bitten, the boys manage one last big celebration After a successful hunt in the woods for birds, the younger brother proves particularly successful and nabs a richly colored pheasant. After they prepare the pheasant is stripped for the boys' festival, and the younger brother has a necklace made out of these birds' feathers, and that just really further highlights his sort of mythological nature.
It's very tribal, this part. There's a bonfire, they're kind of celebrating. Then the festival quietens down, and then finally the boys realize that the girl is actually quite sick. And the deserter, who you'll remember from before, he sort of takes charge of the situation. It turns out that he's actually a doctor, and he's, despite being a deserter, he's actually shown to be quite humane, and
this is the contrast with the village doctor, who again was totally morally bankrupt. The deserter clearly cares about the weak and the vulnerable, and this is where his characterization begins to change. He's on the upswing, and we just begin to like him more and more as a reader.
At this point, the book is all about everyone trying to help this girl. The narrator and Lee, the Korean boy, they try to go and find an ice bag for the girl. So far, they actually go to the headman's house, and up until now, they've been very reluctant to go into the headman's house to look for anything. But right now, finally, they think that only the headman is going to have ice in his house, so they go there. And Lee, who is a Korean boy, seems to know everything about the house because his family was actually serving the headman before and performing forced labor. So one of the Korean families who was made to perform forced labor.
Yeah, and then they, after getting the ice bag, walk back to the village square. The narrator is confronted by Minami and the other boys, who are now convinced that the girl has the plague and that the dog gave it to her. They argue, but eventually Minami whistles to the dog, and as it comes to him, he kills it with a blow to the head using an oak branch. The younger brother is immensely distraught, and later that night, when the narrator returns to their quarters, he finds his brother has gone.
Minami and the narrator's relationship up until now was also sort of interesting, right? They're kind of trying to fight for the position of leader of the group, and Minami is, both Minami and the narrator are of similar age, but Minami seems a bit more cruel.
You could interpret it that way. I think that's a fair interpretation. My interpretation was sort of that Minami is sort of maybe the rebel or just the, someone who doesn't follow any authority. He just seems, at the beginning, he's one of the kids who's trying to escape, and he has this dream of going to the south. That's why his name means literally south.
So the dog is especially as the dog is a representation of what is good. Animals are, we talked about in the last episode as well, recurring theme in the whole book, because if you can't be good to animals, then how can you be good to each other? That's sort of where O is coming from. Particularly, actually, if you show mercy to animals, then it indicates that maybe you are a bit more.
Yeah, and this is where the oasis that the boys have built really starts to unravel. By killing the dog, they're just expressing the same instincts as the adults. They killed the dog because Minami and these other boys are worried about getting the virus, which they don't even know exists, and they're controlled by their own fear and self-interest.
So the plague itself is a sort of metaphor for fear. Given our present day and time, I totally can relate to that, because sometimes, especially in places like Japan with the pandemic, in Kyoto, you don't really, there's not as many cases as the rest of the world. So, but there's still the fear of getting this disease, and it certainly determines how you interact with other people. For the boys as well, I think this plague in this village is not as real to them because they are facing other challenges, and the plague is much more real for the villagers. But then now we see that it starts becoming more closer to home for them because people they know are starting to get the disease. So the girl is pretty sick by now. She's just lying in her bed. And then the narrator is told by the deserter to go and get some snow, because it's still snowing, to put in this ice bag. And then we have this passage.
I knelt down in the snow and started to collect it with frozen, numbed fingers. My brother had abandoned me, and my first love was gasping with her small buttocks, covered in excrement like blood. I felt the plague swamping through the valley with a terrible force, like a cloudburst, catching me, overflowing all around us, leaving us unable to move. I was at a dead end, and all I could do was bend over in the dark night road and collect dirty snow, sobbing.
Yeah, in the course of one chapter, everything that the narrator has fought for completely disintegrates.
Especially as the children are sort of making up I wouldn't call that an oasis myself, but they're really finding happiness and joy in very simple things. And, if we could all live like that, we'd probably all be a little bit happier. But this oasis of freedom collapses because the world outside is insane.
Reminded me of a quote from Sartre, and, Oe was very influenced by Sartre and interviewed Sartre, etc. But Sartre has this quote in Existentialism is a Humanism that reads, "I cannot make liberty my aim unless I make that of others equally my aim." It's an important existentialist statement, because you can also do the opposite, which would be, say, something like social nativism, where you're saying, well, let's make everything better for white people and oppress black people, which is that's another platform. But Sartre is saying, no, it's got to be good for all of us or it's not going to be good.
So then coming back to the book, the community that the boys have made, it's sort of gripped for the fear of plague. It's, the foundation of it has come loose, basically. And the narrator is comforted by the deserter, and they're sort of lying together in this granary, and the narrator now starts to find him beautiful.
The deserter becomes desirable, and it seems like he's been transformed by his mercy towards the girl, which makes sense, right? Because the narrator is in love with the girl, the deserter helps the girl, the narrator finds the deserter attractive. I think that makes sense as a sort of syllogism. So the next morning, the narrator wakes up, the villagers have come back, they've brought the military police back with them, and these police are still searching for the deserter. The boys are corralled together, and after some time they hear shots fired. Then they see the captured deserter being marched through the town, an open wound gleaming above his waist. Later, the villagers catch hold of Lee, who has also run away, and throw him in with the other boys. Lee reveals that he found the younger brother's kit bag in the valley, and the narrator realizes his brother has died. It's not explicitly stated, but we can make that assumption.
But then the headman's reaction to all this is that he's just very, very upset by what the boys have done to the village, and he thinks that they should be beaten to death, which I thought was an overreaction by all standards. And though the intentions of these boys may have been different, the headman doesn't care about that. He just perceives the damage that his village has seen. So he promises to the boys not to mention the boys' misdeeds if they don't mention that they had been abandoned. So even in this case, we see that the headman's just trying to cover his own back.
Yeah, you really do hate him. So, Oe has done a good job characterizing him. And then the boys are threatened by a villager's spear, and then given rice balls to force them to toe the village line, because at this point, just plain rice balls are a luxury for them. And the narrator alone refuses to give in. At last, the headman tells him that they will let him go, and they take him across the valley on the trolley. But on the other side of the valley, the headman's true intent becomes clear. The blacksmith, the narrator darts off into the bush, pursued by the villagers.
I didn't know what to do to get away through the night forest, fleeing from the brutal villagers and escape harm. I didn't even know if I still had the strength to run anymore. I was only a child, tired, insanely angry, tearful, shivering with cold and hunger. Suddenly a wind blew up, carrying the sound of the villagers' footsteps growing nearer, closing in on me. I got up, clenching my teeth, and dashed into the deeper darkness between the trees and the darker undergrowth.
Yeah, pretty grim ending. Very visual. You can see this kid in the middle of this madness, basically. Because the night forest, it's like, yeah, he has nowhere to go.
Yeah. And then from this, we get that the title is not only about the adults being really, really callous, but it's about their attempt to actively weed out and kill off any voice of conscience or dissent. The latter half of this book is the stronger part of the book.
I like this book. Oe has a visual style of writing that takes some getting used to.
So if you like this book, there's also some other relevant reading you could do. There is another book that Oe wrote later, another novel, called The Trial of Nipthebuzzkids, where he comments on this novel in a very postmodern sort of way. The only problem there is that it's only available in Japanese as far as I can tell. He also wrote another book called Goodbye, My Book, which is about Mishima. If Mishima had survived his coup attempt, and then he's released 30 years later, and then he goes on to start a cult, which sounds like an interesting premise.
Well, Mishima Yukio was, for those listeners who are just joining us from this episode, was the writer of The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which we covered in our last few sets of episodes. So if you haven't already, you can check that out. Mishima committed seppuku, so he killed himself.
Yeah, so this is sort of an alternate history novel. Oe writes a lot of books that aren't fiction. For instance, he has a primer just on an introduction to literature, which is kind of interesting for a Nobel Prize winner to write, I think. He also has a book on writing called Shousetsu no Houhou, which is, again, not translated in English, but that would be the methods of the novel, which sounds really interesting, and I would like to read it, but unfortunately I'm in the US right now, and I can't get a copy of it online.
One of Oe's most recognized books is The Silent Cry.
A lot of people say that that's his best book.
I haven't read it myself, but it sounds like he used a very, even more complicated style of writing.
It's definitely more of the Joycean writer who takes extreme pleasure in, bending the language out of its normal use.
Yeah, because I read that he lost half his readership after that book. Yeah, the book itself did very well. And then his editor claimed that Oe lost half his readership after this book. So then Oe became aware that his prose was getting a bit too cluttered and tried to change it once again. Well, I think earlier in the last episode, we were talking about the brother, the character of the younger brother in Nipthebuzzkids, and the relationship of the brother with the narrator, and also the hermaphrodite aspect of the younger brother. But apparently all this comes up again in The Silent Cry. And it's like a recurring character. So Oe was always sort of playing with this, version of the self, like multiple versions of the same thing.
Yeah, and that goes back to, I don't think we mentioned it, but Oe talks about this theory of elaboration that he gets from Edward Said, which Edward Said is really famous for his book Orientalism. And I didn't actually know he had written anything else that was majorly significant, but Edward Said has this book on music called Elaborations, and Oe sort of was influenced that and how he writes and taking the same theme and reworking it and doing it in a new way.
Yeah, and I suppose because his son, who we mentioned before, is has a severe disability. He plays in an orchestra, so there's a lot of connection for the whole family with music. And also Oe married his friend's wife, and his friend was a famous Japanese director, who was Itami Juzo, who directed this film called Tampopo, which is all about ramen. It's like food and sex.
At least 30% of the restaurants in the US, Japanese restaurants, are called Tampopo, is my feeling. Maybe that's not correct.
It got really famous in the US, this film, and it didn't do quite as well in Japan, actually. And it's like, it's okay. It's fun. It's a decent film, but it's not, it's not amazing. But anyway, this director that Itami Juzo was fairly famous, and Koei Kanzaburo married his sister. But then Itami Juzo later committed suicide.
Well, that game, like 5 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where everyone is connected to Kevin Bacon by 5 people. But this is like the suicide version of that for Japanese authors.
Literally every writer we've discussed so far has some connection to suicide. Either they committed themselves or someone close to them committed it. Pretty bad.
Well, we're doing Tanizaki next. He didn't commit suicide, and I don't know that he's connected to suicide in any way.
That's hopeful. That gives me a sense of hope.
Although he probably knew Octogawa at some point, so there you go.
The next book we're reading is Makioka Sisters, and it's by
Tanizaki Junichiro.
It's one of his most famous works. So this book is set in Kansai, which is like Kyoto, Osaka.
Yeah, and he's one of the most famous modern Japanese writers as well. A lot of people really like him, so I'm sure a lot of people will like this novel. Outro?
Okay, so that was the end of our set of episodes on Oe Kenzaburo's Nipthebuzzkids. You can find us on Patreon, where you can access extended show notes and also become a contributor. It's nice to see that there's more people listening to our podcast from all around the world. We've even got a listener from Chile and Romania, so that's cool. So if you're listening, we'd love to hear from you. Just drop us a note on paperpilgrims@gmail.com, even if just to say hi, konnichiwa. So check us out on there and look forward to the space for the next episode. Thank you for listening. Sayonara.